everyone. Thank you so much for joining our session. We're going to do this session just a little bit differently, and we're going to keep this a little more conversational. My name is Nishi Whiteley. I'm the COO of CReDO Science, and I work every day with Dr. Ethan Russo. We work to make cannabis safer and better. And so for us, that includes formulation, clinical research, education, and consulting. And we both have had the opportunity to work with Dr. Sue Sisley. And so this is going to be a really fun conversation, I think.
Uncensored.
Right. So I'm guessing that you guys probably know a little bit about each of our panelists. And so I'm going to give you just a very brief intro. The one I gave at lunch for Ethan was much longer than what he really appreciates. So these two are world-renowned scientists and leaders in the cannabis space. Ethan is a neurologist. Sue is an internist and a psychiatrist, and both have been tireless advocates for not only cannabis reform in our country, but also really leading voices in research and development. And so they each bring super unique perspectives that are highly complementary to one another to this conversation. And so we're going to cover a lot of ground today, and I intend to turn the mic over to you guys at some point so that we can get some of your questions answered as well. But I will say that research and product development, especially drug development, is not as easy as it should be in our country. And so I want to start by asking the panelists a little bit about the challenges that they've experienced over the last 20 plus years of working in this space. So ladies first, Dr. Sue Sisley, if you would talk a little bit about your background and really the uphill battle that you have faced in trying to get the research done that you're so passionate about. You have a microphone?
No, I'll grab this. I have to admit that my path to cannabis research was inspired a whole lot by this gentleman, and you could hear from his keynote earlier how many researchers have been spurred on by his work, and he's really laid the foundation for all of us. It's such an honor to be up here with you. I think, a lot of my work spans not the science and also public policy. So I feel strongly that you cannot be a researcher in this area easily without also working on reforming laws that are inhibiting this research. And that's part of why, I think maybe 2 decades ago, Ethan was one of the first scientists to actually post pictures of the cannabis from NIDA. And at that time, I'd never even tried cannabis, but I knew that this was not normal and not representative of the real world. And so I think that has really helped us to question. There aren't a lot of scientists that are willing to stick their neck out and challenge the government, because it is very, it can be punitive. If you do that, you may find that your stuff gets, put into a black hole. You don't get approvals as quickly, or maybe never. So you're always trying to walk that tightrope. Yeah, if we get fired. Some of the best scientists have been fired from their universities. But I think that, much of my efforts have been focused on trying to persuade the government to eliminate some of the ridiculous barriers that from when I first started doing clinical trials with cannabis, MAPS was my sponsor at that point, and we were looking at this absurd additional layer of government approval. The Public Health Service, remember, had this. So after you'd already achieved FDA approval, which was hard enough, you had to go through this other Public Health Service approval that took years and could delay your study, for a long time. And often, you were at risk of losing your grants or whatever. So we finally managed to dismantle that. I feel like at this point, I did have a slide. I don't know if they have it up there, but I did bring you guys a slide that depicts the regulatory pathway for cannabis research in the US. I don't know if you, oh yeah, there it is. Yep, that's it. So you can see all these different boxes are different, departments in the government, regulatory hurdles that you have to go through. And you can see this is brutal. And a lot of researchers never make it through this. Like they see this and they're often totally daunted by this process and say, how could I ever be successful here? So it's been really hard to recruit good people because most of them will go into safety studies instead, which is so much easier, right? If you just do what the government wants, which is proving the harmful effects and addiction potential of cannabis, you can pretty much get all the government money that you want from NIDA and all these different. But if you dare say you want to study it as a medicine, it's a much more challenging situation. And luckily, Ethan has been willing to, continue to hurdle these, and inspired a lot of us to try, put our toe in the water. So, so that's how we started out doing phase 2 trials with cannabis. And I was doing a variety while we were waiting. One of our studies took 7 years to get through all the regulatory hurdles and get underway. And then we, of course, were concerned that the quality of the cannabis might be harming our outcomes. And we still feel that might have happened because we produced a negative study looking at 80 veterans who inhaled government cannabis for treating PTSD, and the study, placebo won, but still, people did show improvement, especially the high THC arm and the 1-to-1 did okay, but not enough. And that's why we were trying to make the argument that we want to replicate this study with a more robust design and using real world cannabis this time. So that's what we're attempting to do. I'm going to talk to you more because I have another slide later that I can show you about this, but I want to turn it back over.
Great. Thank you. Ethan, when you address some of the challenges that you've had in research and development, if you could go back in time all the way to testifying with Judge Francis Young and talking about the quality of government cannabis, that would be much appreciated.
So 1937, what they called marijuana was made federally illegal on false pretenses. In fact, the head of the American Medical Association testified against its prohibition because it was still at that time in medical use. Fast forward a few decades, in 1995, spent my sabbatical in the rainforest in Peru working with the Machigenga people. When I came back, I knew I wanted to transition my career into medical research, specifically with psychedelics and psychoactives. By then it was 1996, Prop 215 was happening in California, and I quickly got embroiled in what we'll call the cannabis controversy. By that time, as a neurologist, I was well aware that many of my patients, particularly those with multiple sclerosis, were using cannabis to advantage to treat their symptoms. Anyway, at that time, the only person that was successful in getting approval to study cannabis clinically was Donald Abrams, who was looking at patients with AIDS. And the way he finally got approval to do it was by not looking at whether cannabis helped AIDS patients, but rather, would it prove harmful? That was the premise of the investigation. I was recruited to try a different tack, and that was to look at therapeutic benefits of cannabis in migraine. Let's see, in 1997, I was turned down by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And at that time, everything had to go through them. It wasn't like a traditional drug where you applied to the Food and Drug Administration for what's called an investigational new drug. In 1998, it was the same thing. Yep. 98, it was the same thing. In 99, they changed the rules. You could apply directly to the FDA, and my protocol to look at cannabis and migraine was approved by them. But as Sue mentioned, there was another layer of review, what they call the Public Health Service review. And I will say, not that I like to engage in sour grapes, but there was no neurologist on the panel. There was no psychiatrist on the panel. Anyone was turned down. By this time, I had fallen in love with cannabis and its science and the endocannabinoid system. I'd already published an article in the journal Pain on cannabis and migraine. That got the notice of Jeffrey Guy, who started GW Pharmaceuticals with a license from the British Home Office to develop cannabis as a pharmaceutical. So there were a couple of results about this. I never did the study in migraine with cannabis, and it's been now 28 years. But there were two results. I didn't go into I went into this to do research on therapeutic benefits. I didn't intend to become an activist, but the government turned me into one. The other thing that happened was I got older. So I'd been turned down in the 90s. The study you saw earlier, Spindle et al., about THC and migraine, by this time, when we applied to the National Institutes of Health for grant funding for this study, I was considered an asset. So I like to say that it took me 20 years to become a good old boy in the eyes of the hierarchy. So if you're stupid enough and persistent enough, sometimes you can succeed in this arena, but it's a morass out there, and it's not based on science. It is based on politics and how persistent you really can be.
Thank you. So let's have a little bit of a leveling conversation about some of what is behind us. So this is an excellent image. And so let's begin with explaining to our audience, what is IRB approval and why is that important?
Sure. So that everywhere else in the world, this is known as an ethics committee. In the US, it's an institutional review board, which is an obvious euphemism. What the heck does that mean? Could be anything. But it is the idea that you have physicians, sometimes hospital administrators, ethicists, and usually patient representatives that try to ensure that the proposed study is going to be safe and doesn't harm patients. And this is a necessary step to do almost any kind of investigation with any kind of new drug, let alone cannabis.
Thank you. And Sue, is it true, am I reading this right, that you have additional steps in the state of Arizona?
We don't in Arizona, but many states do. So California has several additional layers of government red tape. The most important part of this slide, in my opinion, though, is that FDA approval has to be obtained up front. And FDA, from my experience, has been the biggest blockade.
I was going to go there next.
Yeah. They have been extremely difficult to work with because they are now proving that they're not purely a scientific body, but a political body. They are subject to all the same whims of any other government agency when it comes to who's their boss, how to appeal to the Congress that allocates their budget. And they don't like cannabis. That's what we've, learned over all these decades, is that they seem to despise it, actually. I mean, that when we went in for all these years, we finally had our first face-to-face meeting with FDA recently, because we have a study, actually I have a slide about that. We have a study that's been on clinical hold now for, this is our 4th year. And one more. There it is. Yeah. So this was the front page of Washington Post just a couple months ago that highlighted this situation that has been so aggravating, where we have basically the marijuana ballot initiative in Michigan. Remember when they passed adult use in Michigan a few years ago? They wrote in the statute said that they had to allocate $40 million to veterans cannabis research. So that was a huge victory for science, because that was the most serious cannabis research money we'd ever seen. And it was from sales tax, right, generated. So in the first year of that ballot initiative, we already had the $40 million set aside right away, because they, raised $100 million from adult use immediately. So $40 million, and went through the proper RFP process and was allocated to 4 different entities. So our group, with MAPS as my sponsor, got a $12 million grant, a lump sum up front, that we have not been able to spend, because we are not allowed to proceed with the trial. 4 years later, FDA is still creating, raising issues that we feel are unscientific, unjustified, but we keep going back and forth with them. We've initiated a formal dispute resolution now. We hope to, if that's not successful, we will probably litigate, because, this is not just our problem. This 40 million, all these other scientists who are also, they're waiting in line for FDA as well. None of the 40 million has been able to be spent on these studies, and the veterans suicide epidemic continues. We don't have any good solutions for how to curb the suicide epidemic, and that's why the state of Michigan chose to invest $40 million to help uncover some answers maybe about what treatments could be effective. And FDA, and believe me, we have called out the cavalry. We've taken thousands of patients to Congress. We've had, members of Congress writing letters to FDA. FDA writes back a 1-sentence response to these congressmen who are in charge of their budget. They're so arrogant, they can't even be bothered to write a legitimate rebuttal. They wrote, please review the MAPS website, the study sponsor, where it talks about the timeline of all the denials. And that was the only response, these congressmen. So it just shows you they're like the banks, like too big to fail almost. And I think the most surprising part of our visit to the FDA, the first face-to-face one, there were 6 people sitting across the table from us from FDA. None of them introduced themselves. They refused. We asked them, who are you? And they wouldn't disclose that. And then they spent a half hour arguing that inhaled cannabis was too dangerous because of the popcorn lung. And so I said, where are you getting this? And they said, well, it's all over the media. And we said, well, first of all, we're not asking people to inhale oil, right? This is vaporized and smoked dry flower. So they weren't even looking at the exact study drug we were using, which we'd given them piles and piles of information about the quality of the drug. And we were using GMP grade cannabis from Canada. We were going to be importing it just to make sure that it met GMP. They still disputed that. When we asked them, where is this popcorn lung idea being, and they said, oh, our pulmonary division reported this to us. And the pulmonary division conveniently wasn't available at the meeting. They were supposed to be there. And by the way, just to get into the building, there were like 5 layers of security just to enter into the meeting, which just shows you they literally hate the public. They do not want any interaction with us. And, I'm just going to be really blunt here. The FDA is a cancer when it comes to cannabis research. I'm just going to be really provocative here and just say my true thoughts that they are a cancer and they need to be removed from this process, because if they continue to impede research like this, there won't be any cannabis research in human trial. Remember, every human trial in the US on any controlled substance, Schedule 1 or Schedule 5. So they don't think that we're going to fix this by moving to Schedule 3. FDA will still be the blockade in the way of all this. So.
And we're going to get into.
Either a food or a drug.
Yeah. So we'll get into that here in just a minute. We'll talk about what happens when we do Schedule 3. But I would like to stay on FDA for just a moment. And Ethan, can you talk a little bit about how the FDA approaches traditional drug development, and which is different from what Sue is trying to do, and they are likely to be somewhat more amenable to traditional drug development, even though they still don't love cannabis. So if you could give us the perspective from the other side.
Sure, I'll address that, but I want to preface it by saying you can see now why I've spent a majority of the last 28 years working for foreign companies. Yeah. So the traditional drug approach has three criteria you have to meet. You have to show efficacy, your drug works; safety, your drug is safe; and consistency. And the consistency is the really hard part in cannabis research, because particularly with cannabis flower, there's innate variability. It's not just that one cannabis is chemically different to another. It is that the top flower is actually different than the flowers lower down. And seedlings are all different. But beyond that, and this is a point my good friend Rick Doblin and I have vehemently disagreed with for all of the last 28 years. He has believed that smoked cannabis could be FDA approved. I'm here to tell you that it will never happen. It should be studied because people are doing it and people benefit from it. But among other reasons, aside from the variability, is the fact that it has a pulmonary delivery. That's a way of saying that you inhale to do it. The FDA does not like the idea of smoke. It does not like the idea of potential carcinogens, which are in cannabis smoke, even though cannabis alone without tobacco is not associated with lung cancer. They do not like drugs that are applied to the lungs unless it's to treat the lungs. So if you were treating asthma, maybe. For instance, there have been efforts to develop pulmonary administered insulin. They don't like that. So you can't, if you're treating epilepsy with an inhaled drug, the reason is you only got two lungs. It's sort of an essential organ, we think. It's just not going to happen. But beyond that, the safety, efficacy, and consistency. The real challenge with any herbal drug is showing this amazing amount of consistency over time. Now, it has been done. It can be done in the future. Sativex, drug I worked on for many years at GW Pharmaceuticals, is approved in 30 countries for spasticity and MS. It was tested for cancer pain. You heard earlier that it didn't work. However, we have to qualify that. When you look at the stratified data, first of all, there were 2 phase 2 studies in which it worked, statistically significant. The phase 3s didn't work, but there was a reason. It worked in the American subspecies, but it didn't work as well in patients from Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and Romania. Having been these places, I can tell you in Romania, you come around the corner to see the doctor. There are 15 patients in the hall with only 5 seats, a naked light bulb up here. In Romania at that time, you had to be extremely sick with your cancer to even get an opioid. And by the time you failed that to have access to cannabis in the study, you were near death. So the patients in Eastern Europe were too sick at the time they initiated the study. In less sick American patients who nonetheless failed opioid treatment of their pain, it worked. So by that time, Otsuka, the sponsor of the study from GW, had abandoned the effort. But despite all this, there is an aspect of the regulatory procedure called chemistry, manufacturing, and control. And that's, among other things, where you show that the stuff that you used 9 years ago is exactly the same as today. And GW was able to show that 25 batches of Sativex over 9 years were on a spectral analysis. It looked like single peaks of all these different components, not any particular variance at all. Prior to this, in Europe, for herbal preparations, your components had to be plus or minus 10%. This was nothing like that. It was probably 1% or less. You also had to categorize everything that was in it. This was a medicine that was made from aerial parts of cannabis, and there were hundreds of components. So you see, trying to get this the same required very stringent approaches to growth and development. Specifically, it was cloned plants, vegetative propagation. It was always 77 days from the time the cuttings were put out until they were harvested, not 76, not 78. There was a established procedure for extraction, CO2 extraction, and everything else. That's what it takes to make a drug that is standardized, consistent enough to pass the process. The FDA does have what's called the botanical guidance, which is basically the blueprint on how you make a pharmaceutical from a botanical drug, meaning a plant. Again, the only real difference between this and a conventional new chemical entity, meaning a synthesized drug, is that characterization of all the components of the plant.
Thank you, Ethan. One thing I want to specify is that traditional drug development is usually something that's a single molecule. And when we're talking about botanical drug development, it's coming from the cannabis plant, but it'll have multiple active components. So cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids, other components, canflavins. And so it is much more difficult to get consistency in chemistry and manufacturing when you have so many different components in your drug. So I want to shift gears just a little bit, and we're going to talk about the DEA. And this is something that Sue has a tremendous amount of experience with. She loves them. So can you talk about all that you have gone through to be able to get your Schedule I license? Because the original supplier of federal cannabis made it very difficult for her to do her research, because people who were using cannabis previously knew that the street cannabis that they were getting was so far superior to what she was getting access to. And, kudos to her for spending so much time, energy, and money to create the Scottsdale Research Institute so that she can grow great cannabis and to do better research. So if you'll talk about the DEA.
Yeah, I think I was telling you earlier that, we went through all the proper channels to try to change laws through Congress and all the other branches that were eligible. But ultimately, we had to, our only success was through the court system, which is very difficult. Usually, federal court will always side with the federal agencies. They don't usually, it's hard to find federal judges who will see the merit of this, or even that you have to be able to prove you have legal standing. So a lot of people sue the federal government. I don't know if you know that. There's tons of people that file against them, and they're usually immediately dismissed for no standing or a variety of other things. But I got really lucky. I found this really badass team of two young lawyers who had no experience with, they were IP attorneys, had never been in the cannabis space or psychedelic space at all. They happened to be, I was speaking, doing a lecture at South by Southwest, and these guys were in Houston. They drove down, they happened to just walk into my lecture randomly, and they were so taken aback by the story, how the federal government has systematically impeded this research for so many decades. And one technique that they used was by making sure that we only had access to this suboptimal cannabis, very diluted material that would definitely, it would harm our outcomes when it came to measuring efficacy. And so eventually they were able to become expert, true scholars on the Controlled Substance Act. And they developed legal arguments that were unassailable, and they just kept pushing forward. We had 3 different petitions in federal court, one in DC Circuit, one in Ninth Circuit. Ultimately, we broke through the court, the panel of federal judges agreed that this, was not what the CSA calls an adequate and uninterrupted supply. It was neither adequate, and it's certainly uninterrupted. It would take years sometimes to get cannabis from UMass, and it was almost never what we had asked for. So, as I said at the session earlier, they have improved quite a bit. We've been working with Dr. El Soli to show him how he can expand his genetics and he wasn't aware that he could legally do that. So now he knows that seeds are legal. I don't think he realized seeds and spores are federally legal, and he's allowed to bring them in and expand his library. So I think he's doing a much better job. But in the meantime, we've been able to break that monopoly that has existed for 53 years and finally open the door for lots of other manufacturers besides us. So there's no longer a monopoly. I think there might be 10 different license holders now that are supposed to be growing federally legal cannabis. I'll just be just really upfront with you that my impression of several of these growers is that they don't know the first thing about how to grow cannabis. They're hedge fund guys who thought, oh, this would be great to have a federal license because they couldn't get a state license maybe, or they're too lazy to compete in that market. So they said, we're just going to apply for the federal one, and they got it, and they didn't have any qualifications, and they're not growing anything. And so DEA is trying to crack down on this now because they've heard feedback from scientists saying this is totally unacceptable. They picked people who have no qualifications, and so hopefully they will be removed, but it's not easy to remove people once they have a license. It's really difficult. So I don't know how long this farce is going to continue, but I will tell you that we are growing cannabis and shipping it. We just shipped 10 kilos to Yale for their imaging studies. They're doing, we're trying to be, good stewards because we work so hard to open this door. But in fact, we are also a tiny nonprofit with no paid staff. And it is very difficult to keep this afloat because cannabis, unlike our psilocybin mushroom farming, which, these little mushrooms, they do great without a lot of TLC, they can just, that we have an automated system for the mushrooms and the peyote growing that does really well without a lot of human interaction. But cannabis needs a lot of oversight, and we are not We don't have the resources to do this long-term. So I don't know how long we're going to keep this afloat, but I hope we can keep, we want to be able to, we have a study that we just got funded from the state of Arizona of looking at autism, we're making we just grew about 5 kilos for cannabis oil that we're using in this autism trial. So I don't know how much one, but yeah, that's the story.
Thank you. So both parties here are doing research in the US. It is much more difficult to do research in human beings with a Schedule I drug than it is with something that qualifies as hemp. And so I'm going to ask both of you to talk a little bit about your ongoing projects that aren't FDA regulatory approval track research projects. And if you could explain to our audience the trial design and why you chose that, and how is the information that you are getting from the data, how will that be used and benefit industry? So I've got several layers in there. If you don't answer it, I'll circle back.
Okay, well, I'll try. So the study I presented at lunch with cannabigerol was a bona fide randomized controlled trial. We did not submit that to the FDA. It went through the IRB, Institutional Review Board at Washington State University, which is unique in allowing this kind of thing. And the rationale was, look, this stuff, meaning cannabigerol based preparations, is widely available in the Pacific Northwest. Hundreds of people are using this material. No one's been hurt by it. We know exactly what's in it, and they allowed us to go ahead. Now, again, there was method to the madness. I knew that we needed this kind of study as a prelude to eventually filing an investigational new drug application with the FDA. And at some point, there now would be the opportunity to develop a pharmaceutical. However, it's much more likely that we are going to do it somewhere else, or that we're going to develop supplements that would be available in legal markets that wouldn't go through the FDA process. So there are all these possibilities. But again, most of the time, if I wanted to study an even more exotic, less known phytocannabinoid from the plant, very likely the first thing that would happen would be that we'd be told you need an IND through the FDA before you can do anything. So that would be the stumbling block. It's very different in other countries. And I mean, I've often made the statement that because of politics, the US has sort of ceded this research ability to other countries. There's much more going on in Canada with 1/10 of our population. There's much, much more going on in Israel where there are very different attitudes about this drug. And the only two cannabis-based pharmaceuticals were developed in England, which overall is a much more conservative country than this one. So it could be different. We'd all like it to be different, but that's the current state of affairs.
Did you see in Australia where they're reimbursing? Yeah, so
42%
can you believe that?
research.
Yeah, so if you pay for your own, control trial, the government will reimburse you 42%.
42%.
Yeah, so it's true.
The cost of a clinical trial just went way down.
Exactly. So yeah, they're really bounding ahead of us. And I know a lot of researchers who've moved their operations to Australia just to be able to take advantage of that tax rebate. So, or the rebate itself. So I think in our case, we are, we started out with a mission of bringing inhaled cannabis all the way to FDA approval. And as Ethan mentioned, this debate between him and Rick Doblin at MAPS about, Rick is convinced that he can get smoked cannabis through FDA. We've given up on that. I agree with Ethan at this point. Initially I thought, Ethan's just really jaded. He does, and now I see that he was absolutely right. And we've, re-engineered our mission to focus on vaporized cannabis, because we do feel like that does have potential. There's no products of combustion. It's well tolerated. And we would be looking at vaporized dry flower for treating pain is what we're pursuing. And so we veered off into a secondary, research pursuit of the autism trial, just because we have a real problem in Arizona where families with autistic children don't have any legal protection. In Arizona, people who are using cannabis for treating that are totally vulnerable to CPS and prosecution and everything, because our medical cards don't have that as a qualifying condition. So part of the reason we want to do the trial is to create a safe harbor for people that are using cannabis with their children, to make sure that they have some legal protection, but also we want to add to the body of data, because there's already some really excellent data that's come out of Israel looking at cannabis for autism. So it's trying to dial in what is the right formulation, what's the right ratio of cannabinoids. And so that's supposed to be starting this month. The state of Arizona, in the middle of a $2 billion budget deficit, our state issued $5 million for this study and $5 million for psilocybin research. So it's just hard to explain. Our conservative legislature finally, really embracing these treatments. But I think that part of it is, we're kind of a MAGA dominated state, red state, and those folks despise the FDA. So they see a lot of potential for anything that can piss off the FDA or circumvent the FDA somehow. I don't think they realize that these studies, when you're doing human trials on Schedule I drugs or any controlled substance, like I said, you still have to go through FDA to get the studies underway. And if the FDA doesn't like your study, they can keep you in limbo for years, as they're proving now with our veterans trial. So the other one that we mentioned, the $12 million to study 350 military veterans with pain and PTSD using inhaled cannabis. That looks like it will be going to litigation, because FDA continues clinical hold despite numerous appeals. And we don't see any way to overcome this. And all of the other studies are also being blockaded. So
Can you explain to the audience how you approach the trial design so that you can effectively study the outcomes?
Yeah. Well, I think the main thing we focus on is trying to conduct legitimate randomized control trials with the best design possible.
And what does that mean?
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah. So you're looking at two different cohorts, one that is receiving a placebo control. And of course, there's a lot of debate on what's a good placebo, how to not unblind your study. But yeah, so we're trying to, obviously trying to conduct get as many, a largest sample size as we can afford, and try to examine how people keep everybody blinded if possible. So when you're doing, like in our case, we try to do triple blind studies where the study subjects have no idea what they're getting. The investigators may have no idea what anybody's receiving. And even our third party, like independent raters, also are blinded. So that way we can try to demonstrate to FDA that this is truly well designed and nobody knew what anybody was on. You can see from what happened recently with the MDMA rejection by, that MAPS Lycos was turned down, and there was a ton of criticism of how they handled the studies. some sloppiness, missing data. So all that, was a real important wake-up call for all of us who are studying controlled substance, that we've got to really make sure these studies are properly designed, bulletproof, and that the staff are all, well-trained and know how to keep data organized so that you can get through peer review later. So, that's really the key. But yeah.
Yeah, we've got another study planned. This is looking at using a cannabis-based preparation to treat symptoms of menopause, which was reported as beneficial about 150 years ago, but people forget or don't want to consider it. In any event, the way we're going to do this is the formulation closely resembles something that we've done before that was available on the market over the counter. And so, again, with an IRB that's willing to understand the low risk involved of a extremely low THC preparation that really emphasizes the other components, we expect that this is going to be approved and hopefully going in a few months. Yeah, it would be vasomotor symptoms like hot flashes, anxiety, a big part of it, sleeplessness.
Can you talk about the design of the study that we're doing?
Sure. So in the study, women who are in menopause or postmenopausal with symptoms would get the study drug or a placebo. I'm doing that one differently. It won't be chartreuse because this is an oil, not a tincture. And there'll be a lot of, it's going to mostly or all done remotely. There'll be clinical interviews, but additionally, a lot of self-rating scales. How much pain did you have today? How many hot flashes did you have today? There's menopause surveys that look at symptoms and rate those on, again, comparing the study drug to placebo.
So in every indication where a research project is being done, there are certain scientific standard tests or measures that are usually acceptable when you are researching that particular indication. So good research project is going to use those measurement methods. And right now, actually, instead of making a statement, I'm going to ask you guys a question. AI is very popular, and we are starting to see more AI be used in research. And so can each of you speak to both the challenge and the opportunity of integrating AI into our research?
Well, to the extent it can be harnessed to crunch data and show you trends that you wouldn't notice otherwise, I think it's really embryonic at this stage. The potential is vast, but I'd be honest in saying I don't know at this point what the immediate applications are, but I'm certain that they will be there.
So our company, CReDO Science, is working on developing a drug for FDA approval for the treatment of ALS. And we have met with a company that does remote voice measurements for ALS patients. And, one of the things that we were excited about is, okay, what kind of data is this going to show us? But then the question is, will this be acceptable to FDA? And FDA is not on the cutting edge of innovation in anything. So, Sue, what would you say about AI?
We started using AI just for developing SOPs for our manufacturing, and then for even a little bit on the clinical trial side. Then we started implementing AI in the farming environment. So we have an AI powered system for an automated system for managing the mushrooms and the peyote plants. And that enables us to give them a ton of TLC without having to be there every day. So it's been really useful. And I envision that in the farming setting being, especially with controlled indoor ag, it's been really useful. And so, yeah, we're just looking for ways to incorporate it more, especially as a tiny nonprofit without money to pay for people. This is a good strategy.
Thank you. We're going to shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the whole idea of rescheduling versus descheduling. And I know each of you have some very strong opinions about this. So don't hold back. So you have the microphone, so you get to go first. What's going to be the net impact of rescheduling, if anything?
I mean, from a researcher perspective, people who deal with the DEA regularly, remember, we have DEA Schedule I license as a researcher, as a manufacturer of study drugs, as an analytical lab. The only thing that changes for us in our lab is that we don't have to store things in a safe anymore. If it moves to category 3, suddenly we can put it in a steel cage. But I have to admit, our steel cage costs 3 times more. We have a Schedule 3 steel cage right now that costs almost $30,000, and the safe was only $12,000. So it's not really saving us money. I guess there may be some other treaty elements that I'm not sure. I don't see this improving our lives at all, though, because like I said, we still have to deal with the FDA blockade at the very front of the approval process. And until that is eliminated, I don't think anything really changes. The DEA, by the way, I don't know what it was like in the old day, but they've been they have been extremely responsive when it comes to issuing the Schedule I, especially the researcher licenses. So once we have FDA approval and we have IRB approval, the DEA is the least problematic now. So I don't think that is going to, like I said, I don't envision Schedule III improving anything.
Well, the entire thing is based on a myth, and that was the degree of harm inherent in cannabis. So historically, and a few are old enough to remember this in this room, but in 1970, when cannabis was made Schedule I, that was supposed to be a placeholder. So Schedule I means dangerous, addictive, having no recognized medical use. So that was never true of cannabis. Additionally, they were awaiting the results of what was called the Schaefer Commission. And basically they came out and said cannabis should be decriminalized and it should be legal for medical use. This is in 1972. But President Nixon had rejected that before the results were made publicly available. Judge Francis Young in 1988 had said that it should not be in Schedule I, but that was ignored. And then there have been 2 subsequent cases, also taken many years since then. Schedule III doesn't fit there. If there's supposed to be science behind it, it isn't being applied because Schedule III still pertains to a drug with a certain degree of drug abuse liability, meaning, again, that it has some degree of danger or physical addiction. Dr. Adenoff may feel a little bit differently about this. But really, it needs to be descheduled and regulated like other substances with known risks of whatever type. So this would mean regulated like alcohol or regulated like nicotine is. And this would make some sense from a scientific standpoint and be a boon to public health as well as to research capabilities. So that's my stance. And I was asked to join on an organization that was weighing in on the Schedule 3 proposal, and I just didn't take part because I can't honestly say that either that is where it belongs or that this is going to be a great advantage for the reasons that Sue mentioned.
What he's saying. You know, if it was truly descheduled, the FDA would no longer be involved in the approval process for clinical trials. So from that perspective alone, I'm so supportive of descheduling, but also for the reasons Ethan mentioned.
Can we talk a little bit about CBD and the FDA and the huge conundrum that they face to get to your issue?
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So is it a drug? Is it a food? People have been exposed to cannabidiol for thousands of years. And again, we're not aware of anybody dying from it. It's really comical in some instances. Use of CBD has been curtailed to a great extent in Europe because they're taking the position that it's a new entity that really has never been true. So it's a morass. And to be fair, it's not just here. Similar problems are occurring all over the world. And you've got very strange situations, like in Japan. There's a tremendous amount of commerce in CBD in Japan right now, but they're coming out with a law where infinitesimally small amounts of THC would make any product illegal. And chances are that's going to tank the entire CBD industry because rarely, if ever, are those preparations free of THC to that extent. So I don't know what to call it except for a godforsaken mess.
Well, there you go. So let's talk about the upcoming Farm Bill and what Essie winces. Chelsea, that. What do you anticipate will actually get passed, and how will that impact our industry?
Well, I'll start out. I just saw a news story today. They expect this to come up in the lame duck session, and this thing is going to be passed as a package. So what happens with the cannabis part of it or any THC limits? You've got a Congress, I don't know how to say this in a politically correct way. What the current speaker would want is quite different from what some of his constituents want. And I think that the end result is they're just going to kick the can down the road. And they'll probably do another renewal with no changes, which would keep in place the 0.3% THC limit.
I'm just curious more about what happens then if they kick the can down the road, then state by state, they're still going to have to, what is happening in Texas on this issue? I don't know. Is it in terms of like Delta 8 and all that?
So Delta 8 is legal in Texas, and there will likely be multiple bills filed in the upcoming session that would prevent the sale of Delta 8 in Texas. Who knows if it'll pass or if it won't. But, more importantly, it'd be nice if we had some thoughtful regulation around Delta 8. Two operative words, A, regulation, and B, thoughtful. I'm not sure those things intermarry very often. So that's where we are with that. And so give it time. Give it time because it's coming, because people are starting to catch on. So I'm going to get to questions. I want to ask these two one more question, and then I'm going to bring the microphone out. So get your questions ready. But Before we go to the audience questions, I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the future and what you would like to see in terms of important research.
Well, I think you get a hint if you were there at lunch. I think CBG is going, I'm going to make a bold prediction. I think CBG is going to be bigger than CBD in its therapeutic potential. CBD is great, very versatile, but it's not potent, and it really needs help. It as an isolate, pure CBD just doesn't really have the oomph to do all the things that we would like. As an adjunct, an ingredient in whole cannabis extracts, tremendously beneficial. So I see a great future for CBG as well as for THCV, tetrahydrocannabivarin. And again, as you probably heard, with 150 or more phytocannabinoids in the plant, there's so much potential here because, again, every one that we've looked at so far has unique medical properties. Sometimes they overlap, but each one is really different in its therapeutic potential.
I would say I want to just emphasize the chance that there will be a cannabis-based drug either at some point that will treat pain. It will be FDA approved with an indication for chronic pain. And hopefully, what else? I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Howdy, I'm an undergraduate here, but I also have studied clinical herbalism and practiced it. So as herbalists, we look at it as each person is bio-individual. So some medicines don't work on different individuals. Sorry. Do you think that's an issue with cannabis as well and the different terpenes, and that's why you're not seeing that consistency?
Excellent question.
It's a really good point, a very, very valid. And so particularly, I mean, the real wild card in patient-to-patient variability is often endocannabinoid tone. So what is that? Well, it's complex and not something we can readily measure because it is a function of the concentration that individual has of endocannabinoids, anandamide and 2-arachidonoglycerol. Also, the density of their receptors, whether they're active or inactive, the degree of activity of the metabolic enzymes for the endocannabinoids. So, I mean, hopefully in the future, we have a way of measuring these things and having a better idea. There are also genetic factors, some of which can be measured. These can have to do with slow metabolism, like cytochrome 2C9 and 19 and other ones. And then people who shouldn't use cannabis. Nishi and I did a study where we showed that people are susceptible to cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome if they have certain of 5 mutations. And these are different, not present in people who use large amounts of cannabis that don't display the symptoms. So I think the reason your question is so important is, what does it tell us about how we should be approaching this? Well, for one thing, it means that when you have a single drug that goes through the FDA process as an approved pharmaceutical, it isn't going to work for everyone. And this really points out the fact that it's known, can't tell you the author of the study, but the average person who uses cannabis medically often requires 6 months to find the preparation that helps them the best. And so this is really the epitome of individualized medicine. And that's where herbalism shines because sometimes you need more than one plant. And sometimes you need more than one type of cannabis to get where you need to go. And some of us hope that we have the capability of listening to the patient and thinking of what do we need to add next so they have the improvement in their symptoms or the reduction of their side effects.
That's a perfect summary. I just add that I think one of the challenges with these adult use markets that are taking hold in every state now is that just steamrolling medical patients who are striving to go on this personal odyssey where they experiment with all these different formulations. They don't have any guidance anymore. They don't have the right products available in different states. It's all really geared toward the rec user. And that's sad, people really, that's why I vigorously advocate for home grows, because I think people are much better off trying to, farm their own medicine. It's therapeutic and it's a better option probably for a lot of people.
Oh, good. Okay, that's rare. You found a good one, yeah.
Yes, with y'all being cannabis researchers, the talk about the regulation of cannabis on and off, like approving Delta 8 and then taking it away. As a researcher, does that really support or undermine your research, or does it actually highlight or motivate you to research more?
Well, I hope motivate, but again, you understand how little of this is under our control. My objection to Delta 8, well, we had a whole lecture on this. It's in our course. Delta 8 is a natural component of cannabis, but in just tiny amounts. So all of the products that are out there with Delta 8 are synthetically produced. Delta 8 isn't the problem. Delta 8 is much like Delta 9. It's probably about 2/3 as potent in terms of psychoactivity. The problem is how these things are made and what's in them, which is all kinds of contaminants, not just solvents, but other cannabinoids that don't appear in the plant that, we don't even know their toxicity. We do know that there have been a lot of reports to poison centers and to the FDA through the reporting mechanisms of people getting into trouble with these. And it shouldn't happen at all. The reason there are Delta 8 products is twofold. One is everybody grew CBD to ridiculous proportions and couldn't sell it. And so they're transmogrifying it into Delta 8 so they can sell it. That's one. And two is prohibition. If prohibition weren't in place, there would be no Delta 8 because it has no advantage at all. And again, potentially dangerous to any consumer. So I'm not a fan.
Thank you. Mason, I'm coming to you next, but Ms. Heather has asked me to do a little housekeeping, so I want to do that before everybody sneaks away. From 4:30 to 6 p.m. this evening, we have the VIP speaker meet and greet. So if you have a VIP pass, please join us in room 2300E. And tomorrow, I have no idea where it is. Ethan's asking. I'm sorry, I don't know, but we can figure it out together. And then tomorrow, let's see, we'll be open from 9 to 10 for breakfast in the ballroom. And then we have our first breakout session at 10. So I'm going to turn it over to Mason, who has a question.
Hey, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate y'all. So we've heard a lot of really interesting things, like the FDA is kind of the roadblock here, that, rescheduling to Schedule 3, some negatives, some positives. How is it really going to affect us? We don't know yet. But my question is kind of, with research being the answer, we need data, we need science. What does a critical mass look like? Or in your opinion, what is a good strategy to get funding, to get more research happening here on US soil? How do we do this?
I'm the wrong person to ask about funding.
Well, that's what we're talking about next.
Sure, because Nishi and I have spent most of the last 5 years trying to keep our business afloat, and we've managed, but she's not being paid even a fraction of what she's worth. Unfortunately.
None of us are on this stage.
it's all tied up in politics. So, I mean, one, we need people who are willing to get in the face of politicians and say, look, my kid has intractable epilepsy and they've been helped by this, like Piper's doing. It takes people with persistence and dogged determination like Sue to try and go through these channels, as ridiculous as they are. And sometimes you got to go to foreign countries to accomplish your aims. So all of the above.
One thing that is really frustrating about what is happening in this country in terms of cannabis research is that it's expensive, and frankly, it's expensive no matter what country you're doing it in. But it's very difficult to get sufficient amount of funding to do the research, to do drug development. And, we work with several companies in Canada. Their government supports the research that they're doing. Just to give you an example, one of the companies hired 21 interns one summer, all on federal government money. The result of having these very high-level interns was probably advanced that company by 5 years. The Royal Bank of Canada will provide a venture capital loan to early companies, seed stage companies. Right now, one of the companies that we're working with is likely to get approved for a $5 million loan, which will significantly advance our capacity to get an ALS drug to market. As we heard earlier from Sue, Australia is providing a 42% rebate on research. To do an investigator-initiated trial is probably anywhere from, on the very low side, $350,000 upwards of $1 million. Do you guys agree with those numbers? Then if you do other types of trials, you're getting up into the millions. We've just interviewed 3 different CROs, highly qualified, very capable, best-in-class companies. And to do a phase 2 randomized clinical, placebo-controlled clinical trial, we're talking about price tags of anywhere from $10 to $24 million. And the proposals that they provided didn't include a large number of the expenses that we would have to pay. So the work that they are doing is expensive. And one of the things that I would ask all of you to do in your own advocacy is to communicate to our government representatives how important funding this basic research is to public health, really. And I wanted to see if either of you had any additional comments about that, the cost of doing research. And then we'll end on that.
Okay, I'll just suggest, when we were talking about how to secure funding, I think our best successes have occurred by reaching across the aisle with conservative members, because that's the big problem, is electeds generally view this research as like some hippie liberal agenda, and it's been really hard to get them on board. But the main thing is identifying champions especially in the extremist area. Like that's where we've gotten a lot of success, is getting MAGA Republicans to care about this and become spokespeople for this. And suddenly when you have that, a lot of things fall into place, and probably even more so here in Texas. That's such a red state that I think you probably do really well. Obviously you got a lot of folks in the legislature that will, we've heard today about Dan Patrick and some other folks that are being problematic. But yeah, there's got to be ways to win over people and help them become your champion. Then the other thing I would just bring up that I talked about at the last workshop is, of course, do not forget about this opioid settlement fund. It's the only new government money that is available, that it can be applied to research like this, like cannabis, psychedelics. For some reason, psychedelics have surged ahead of cannabis in being able to secure research funding. It's just fascinating to me and frustrating because cannabis deserves just as much funding, but for some reason, psychedelics are the hot new ticket here. And so I would just say, go after that. You have almost $4 billion of opioid settlement funding here in Texas. It would be a tragedy if you allowed that to get 100% allocated to Suboxone and methadone clinics and 12-step and nothing to research, and then leave it on. There is $20 billion of surplus money sitting in your state general fund right now from all the incredible revenue you got from oil and gas. It has to be spent. It's in investment dollars that have to be used. And now is the time that you guys can make a really smart case for Texas sponsoring some of the most important clinical trials in the world right here in your home state. You've already got tons of folks, not just universities, hospitals, all kinds of who would love to jump in on this. $20 billion was just reported here in your state. No other state has that. So while you're enjoying this surplus, I would definitely make a strong case.
So if you get permission to use that money, we've got plenty of ways to help you spend it.
All right. Well, I think we all agree that access to safe, effective medicine really is a human right. And it's unfortunate that we're having to fight so hard for it. But I encourage you all to keep up the fight and continue the good work. And thank you all for being here.